I'm Howard Frank, Director of the Metropolitan Center. Glad you braved the wilds of South Florida highways to be with us this morning, and welcome to the 7th Annual Metro Forum on the State of the South Florida Economy. This forum is on economic sustainability and resilience, and of course that topic is of high salience to the residents and decision makers throughout the region. This forum is part of our 20th year, our 20th anniversary. And I thought I'd give you a very brief history before getting on with the rest of the program. My colleagues tell me I was one of the originals. Is that correct? I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too much gray hair to remember even if I was one of the originals. But 20 years ago, I remember pulling into our old headquarters at 150 Southeast 2nd Avenue, which we have fond memories of. And we were part of what was called a Quality Improvement Program. It was a 3-year seed grant. So I would say on face, we have the seed grant, the planting has done quite well. We were given a mandate to be a nonpartisan policy research center and become what President Rosenberg terms a high neutral forum for discourse on issues of the day. And I think we have succeeded with that. We've developed some distinctive competencies: housing, economic development, land use, and performance improvement for public and nonprofit agencies. For those of you who may not know, in addition to our research, we also do training, primarily for public and nonprofit employees, and it's on a myriad of subjects, supervisory and other topics. Traditionally, our service area was the Tri-County area, but now we've gone international. Last 5 years, we have done the design and delivery of content for the Washington Mandela Fellows. 25 African leaders come to our campus, and we do the curriculum for their intensive 5-week public management training. So we're going in, we're helping to put the I in FIU when it comes to training for public management. Now, speaking as a faculty member, I can say that one of the things of which I'm proudest with the Metropolitan Center is the fact that we have provided support and training for over 70 undergraduate and graduate students throughout our history. As I say, not only do we provide urban policy solutions, we also train the future urban problem solvers. And I know I can get a show of hands. There are some alums from the Metro Center present today, and their track record is astonishing. We turn out leaders in the nonprofit sector, public sector, and we've even put people into higher education as well. Let's see, show of hands. I see Frank, Maria, who else? Stacy. How many? We have a few of the alums here, and I think you would get a unanimous vote that we've done a good job training them. We put people into real-world situations that hones their academic coursework. So that I'm very, very proud of. Today's forum is an example, we'll call it an exemplar of where we are taking ourselves intellectually. And I'll let Ned Murray do the better job laying it out for you. But our hope is to cast community development in South Florida in a holistic manner that encompasses wage dynamics, land use, housing, and the environment in a layered mosaic. And we feel that our eclectic research skills, our ability to draw expert talent from the community and within the university is a natural fit. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass the baton on to my longtime colleague, and I would argue the face of the Metropolitan Center, Dr. Ned Murray. Ned?
Thank you, Howard. Good morning, everybody. I really delight to see everybody here. So many familiar faces and new faces, and I was telling some of the folks that I was talking to before we got started that this is probably, of all the Metro Forums that we've done over the last 20 years, the one I'm most excited about. I'm going to be really interested myself in listening to everyone else after I get out of here, because I know what they're going to say, and I know we're going to do something really special that Howard, you articulated much better than I could ever come up with such language. That holistic and integrated approach to community problem solving is we've never been at such a critical tipping point in South Florida, and for the most part, in most metropolitan areas and other economies throughout the United States and the world. So this is a big picture, and when Alan gets up to speak later, he can certainly speak to that, as will others. But the idea of bringing together these three topics as one integrated perspective that's all ultimately about community development, authentic community development, which we're going to talk about a bit later, is really something new. And I want to salute the local media, the Miami Herald, the Sun Sentinel, Palm Beach Post, WLRN, and other newspapers that collaborated this past weekend. I guess maybe for the first time, all coming together, writing a joint editorial on sea level rise and the need to get serious. Well, guess what? We're going to talk about that today, but we're also going to talk about getting serious about two other important public policy issues, and that being the economy, particularly as it relates to income inequality and wages, but also this critical issue of affordable housing. But they will all come together. It's going to be a bit redundant almost today, and I hope so, because redundancy is good when it comes to talking about these three topics and intersecting them like we will today. So I hope that's the message you take. That's the takeaway of this whole forum, hopefully, that we talk about these issues as one holistic, integrated approach about community development. And that's where our research will be taking us, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, why are we doing this? Well, partly because as the three newspapers and WLRN spoke to over the weekend, the issues that we're talking about in terms of scope and scale are really, really at a critical stage. And I'm going to just go through some of those numbers early on and then kind of get into the meat of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of our community development research agenda. But the distressed communities that exist here in Miami and throughout South Florida, through Broward, Palm Beach, we know what's happened in Monroe County after the hurricane. We're really at a critical issue with respect to all of these topics. And how we relate them, how we intersect them, is going to be critical. So as we look at the path forward, I want to remind you in these first few slides of how serious it is. The scope and the scale is just really, really somewhat frightening. Then we want to talk about this new dynamic of community development. Community development's been around for a long time. It was practiced globally long before it came to the United States. We've kind of messed with it in different ways. We'll talk about that. But there is an authentic community development based on some real guiding principles that we want to get back to. So sometimes when I was talking with Bank United, Claire, and others, Katrina, about this new framework for community development, in some ways it's back to the future, because we're going back to the fundamentals, that we need to revisit those in practice in an authentic type of way. So we're going to talk about that. And then ultimately, this whole issue about housing is one that I know is very important to a lot of you who are here. Obviously, you all know that the Metropolitan Center has been doing housing studies for the past, 13 years now, going back to the original bubble, and then, of course, the recession, and now the recovery, the so-called recovery, and what that has done to the housing market. But we need to think about housing more in terms of creating a more resilient and sustainable economy. Housing is a quality of life issue. Housing is also an issue relative to to a community's well-being, the people who live there, the residents who live there and work and raise their families. We need to understand the economic and social impacts of having a adequate supply of decent, safe, and affordable housing. And I'm going to get back to that topic of decent and safe. That's one we've kind of put to the side a bit over the last few years as we were so focused on affordability. The decent and safe aspect of affordable housing is critical, absolutely critical. And when we start to talk a little bit more about the environment and the issues relative to sea level rise, that'll become all the more clear. But that's going to become the number one discussion from our vantage point over the next few months. And we all saw what happened, of course, last fall after Hurricane Irma and, of course, the hurricanes that hit Texas and the Caribbean. So with that, let's first, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the economic aspects of this because we have speakers following me that are going to really drill down on this a bit. But I want to give it some perspective because when we start to think about community development, when we start to think about sea level rise, when we start to think about how do you build a more resilient and sustainable economy in South Florida, we have to understand what the economy is all about because as I'll get into a little bit later, the economic function of community is fundamental, is basic, it's essential. And if we don't understand the economy and we don't understand how we need to put that function in place to create that underpinning, we can't really move on. We're stuck. And I think we've learned that in many, many ways. So as you look at this employment and poverty rate trends, this is something I've been showing now for a few years, and I've updated it periodically, thanks to my wonderful staff who knows graphics. That's something I can't do. But to kind of track employment growth with the poverty rate. And this is specifically for Miami-Dade. Obviously, we're looking at Broward and Palm Beach and other places as well. But you can see what's happened here. We're now at record employment in Miami-Dade. Record employment. We've never had more jobs than we have now in Miami-Dade. And look at the poverty rate. It's dipped. It's now 18.3%, down a bit. But we have record unemployment. Record employment and low unemployment. We're at just under 5% now. Broward's at 3.5%. So we're doing quite well from that perspective. But yet we have this persistent issue of poverty in Miami-Dade and other parts of South Florida. And it's concentrated, as we'll talk about in a second. Many of you know, I see Commissioner Daniela Levine sitting here, who was a champion of the prosperity study 4 years ago. We've been updating it, Daniela, and thank you. It never would have happened without your support. And we keep looking at how's Miami-Dade doing, and how is it recovering essentially from the recession. And you can see by this one map, we have a series of maps, but this is the one I really want to focus on. Look what's happened with the poverty rate when you start to look at certain neighborhoods. Some of you know, many of you should know, when we did the prosperity study several years ago, we focused on what we found were the 14 most distressed communities, neighborhoods in Miami-Dade. And you can see where they pretty much run. We called it the spine of distress. The spine of distress, which is essentially extended from Miami Gardens to the north all the way down into Florida City along the I-95, US 1 and 441 State 7 corridors. These are your older neighborhoods, predominantly black, new immigrant communities. These are the communities that have been in distress for a long, long time, decades, right? And it's only gotten worse. It's only gotten worse. These are the 14 that we came up with. We created a composite index. We are updating this all the time, and that's in the prosperity study. But what I think what I want to highlight from that are these four essential points. Is the number of folks, number one, these are the first number you see, the 488, 408,000, that's the number of people living in poverty in Miami-Dade. 408, almost 500,000 people living in poverty in Miami-Dade County. And by the way, there's another 255,000 living in poverty in Broward County. And we could find a good chunk in Palm Beach County. You don't think of Palm Beach being poor? Well, guess what? They have concentrated poverty as much as we do down here in Miami-Dade. So 488,000. 250,000 earn less than $25,000 a year. And this is really important because these are people who are working. And we're going to show some numbers real soon so you can understand that. You get 250,000 people earning under $25,000 a year. And guess what? They are working. I think some of you heard me in a couple presentations I've made recently where we focused in on Liberty City. Liberty City has a 75% labor participation rate. 75%. We need to understand that importance because the county itself is about 65%. Population of those distressed neighborhoods themselves, over 400,000, and 34% living in poverty. So the poverty rate in these neighborhoods, these communities, far exceeds the county as a whole. In fact, you have communities within that spine of distress that are actually upwards of 45% in terms of poverty rate and high unemployment, despite having higher labor participation rates than the county. So we've got some really funny numbers there. Why is that? Well, we begin to look at the top occupations in the county. We've done this for Broward County and Palm Beach County as well. You can see here that these are your top 14 job occupations in Miami-Dade. The top 14. These and a few other service sector occupations comprise about 60% of the employment base in Miami-Dade. And look at them. Almost all of them earn under $36,000 a year. Many of them under $22,000 a year. So this is the core of your employment base. So you can see now where we have such high poverty rates and so many working poor, yet we have, despite the fact that we have these high labor participation rates. Which takes us into the housing market. The housing market is much more understandable in terms of affordability once we look at the economic numbers that we just did. Because the question comes up a lot, who can live here, who can afford to buy, who can afford to rent. We see articles in the papers all the time about teachers and others who priced out of the market. Well, look at the numbers. I mean, but look at the economy, number one. That's why we start with the economy, because that's the demand side of the equation. The demand that we're seeing for housing in South Florida is external. That's external demand. It has nothing to do with the residents and workers who live here. Nothing to do with them. But when we begin to hone in on who actually lives here, look at what we're talking about. In Broward County, we have a 6.5 to 1 affordability ratio of median home price to median household income. 8 to 1 in Miami-Dade. I think many of you know, certainly the bankers in the room know, you should be in that 3 to 4 to 1 category. When you get up into 6, 7, 8 to 1, that's not sustainable. Those are almost cartoonish numbers that just don't equate. And the same thing holds for the rental market. The rental market, when we used to look at housing cost and affordability, we always focused on that term cost burden. Well, to be just cost burden these days in South Florida, you're probably in good shape. You're one of the lucky ones if you're just cost burden, because the most growing category is severely cost burden. If you're cost burden, you're at 30% to 50% of your income going towards housing costs. But once you exceed 50% of your income going to housing costs, you're now severely cost burden. That's the fastest growing category. Imagine that, 50, 60, 70 cents on every dollar going towards housing costs. You add transportation costs to that. We actually have communities in Miami-Dade and Broward where the housing and transportation cost index is now over 70%. So 70 cents on every dollar being spent on housing and transportation costs. And it's only getting worse. These numbers are appreciating by the day. Look at this number. These are existing rents, and we looked at a number of different cities, including outside of South Florida, to look at this. So it's not just the South Florida issue, but you have existing rents compared to asking rents. And any of you who've been out in the market lately, any of your children or relatives or friends, you will see that what they're paying and what they would be looking at relative to asking rents, a huge, huge difference. And this is really getting extreme, very extreme. No other market like this in the country, by the way. Here's the piece that I really want to accentuate before I get into the community development piece of this presentation. And that is the issue, getting back to the point I made of the need to create an adequate supply of safe, decent, and affordable housing. I was called by the Miami Herald and Wall Street, and a lot of different journals and newspapers last fall, because we were at the 25th anniversary of Hurricane Andrew. Lo and behold, within a few weeks of that, Irma comes. So all of a sudden, the job conversation changed very quickly. But the conversation, what it really was about was, what if Andrew, after 25 years, would have hit today? And what if it moved a little bit further north? What the impact would be? We don't even want to talk about that. But guess what? That's the reality. I'm going to let others talk about that later on. But Irma alone, if it had taken the original track going up the I-95 corridor that it was projected to go, would have been devastating. So we started looking at the numbers, and the numbers just blow you away. Look at this: 70% of Miami-Dade's housing supply was built prior to 1990. Of course, 1994 was when Miami-Dade passed the building code, first in the country to do that. So anything built before that was obviously essentially non-compliant and certainly highly vulnerable. But you now have 36%, almost close to 400,000 units now 50 years old. I mean, these units, not only do they not meet hurricane codes, the Florida building codes, they're probably not even structurally safe anymore in many cases. Broward, same thing, 87%, 715,000 units, 26% 50 or older. But when you get, once again, into the distressed neighborhoods, because this was our concern, if Irma had come up the I-95 corridor, like Andrew did, hitting a very poor area back in 1992 in Homestead and Florida City, and then all points in between, you had a very old housing stock, or at least a housing stock that was not up to code. So we were very concerned what might happen. And look at this. These are those 14 neighborhoods I talked about earlier. 85% of the housing built prior to 1990, including 73,000 rental units. These are those so-called naturally occurring rental housing that is not safe, it's not decent, and actually it's getting not affordable either. But this is a critical issue. We cannot have this discussion about affordable housing or community development in general without talking about the need to deal with the housing stock. These are some of the numbers from Wilma, just to give you an idea of the damage that Wilma caused. And Wilma was a Category 1. It was, in parts, it was a 2 in parts of Palm Beach when it first came, but that's a Category 1. Imagine a Category 4 or 5 coming into the Miami Broward area and with a direct hit. So here's the map showing those 14 distressed neighborhoods that the staff put together. You can see the concentration of properties, residential properties, where in the dark red and the darker tone. These are properties where, or should I say, communities where 75% or more of the properties are built prior to 1990. So these are the properties that are most vulnerable. So these communities are truly not only distressed economically, but in terms of the housing supply, they are really, really vulnerable. So when we start talking about housing affordability strategies, we need to address this. Same thing. This is now the 50 years or older. Look at those concentrations. Even those in the yellow are at around 45%. So it's not like there's a lot of new housing there. So these communities are highly vulnerable with properties, for the most part, that do not meet current Florida building codes and probably even have other issues relative to their structures and their major systems. So where does this take us? And this is just the beginning, like I said, this conversation I'm having right now. Others will follow soon. And the idea is that given these issues of the economy, the issues of housing, these issues of sea level rise, we need to go forward with this new and bold community development framework. And what does that kind of address? What does it look like? Well, we've been doing some research to date, and what we're finding since we began this research through the support of Bank United, who came to aid last year and believed in what our research was promoting and doing, was to begin looking at the community development literature, but also what was going on, what some of the needs are, where some of the gaps in the area of community development. And what we really found was, so far, and of course the research will continue, is that there really is, until actually recently, we're kind of prodding along doing the same thing over and over in most communities. But there's been sort of a wake-up call the last few years. Of course, 4 years ago, we had the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. So we started thinking about it. How are we dealing with this issue of poverty, and how are we dealing with this issue of the larger economy and housing and all these other issues? So what we're finding is that these needs have become greater and much more magnified, but at the same time much more recognized. But there still is this fragmentation of delivery of a lot of these types of programs, and particularly fragmentation relative to the larger community development delivery system. And that is one of the keys that we need to start to focus on from an institutional framework. We are gradually responding, like I said, particularly in areas of this new normal where we have less federal and state monies. This is happening throughout the country, of course. We need to get used to that. We cannot go to Washington anymore, or Tallahassee here in Florida. We have to figure this out locally with new and innovative ways to approach it, once again in a more holistic and integrated way. And then the idea then is to work collaboratively through institution building at the local level, which was a critical finding of the prosperity study, is to figure out, how do we do this? How do we come up with planning and policy solutions to address these issues in a holistic and integrated way? And they're out there. There's certainly some best practice around the country. There's certainly things that can be done, but the real message here is that we have to do it locally. That it has to be done locally. And if we don't do it, particularly in a place like Miami-Dade in South Florida, we will be greatly impacted, both economically and socially. And when we talk about the social aspects of this, we must begin with a full understanding, really, of what community development really is and the functions of community, which begin, as I mentioned earlier, with the economic functions. That's why we're going to stress the economy and how to build a more resilient economy. That's going to be front and center, because once again, without a strong economy, we're not going to be able to really address any of the issues that we'll be talking about today. So essentially, a resilient community, a sustainable community, will start with a strong and resilient economy. We also need to understand the relationship between the man-made environment and the natural environment, and that's where these social impacts come in. We need to understand that relationship. We need to understand how the different sectors come together, whether it be the economic sectors, the housing, education, health, and how that relates to our coastal areas, our floodplains, and our wetlands, the natural areas that we have to coexist in and begin to plan for. And then this whole idea of a community development delivery system, that'll be really the end goal of the research is really, what does that look like? What does a functioning community development system look like that does fully recognize the functions of community, the economic, the social, and the political meaning action in the classical sense of the word? How do we build that capacity locally to really take on these very severe challenges? So with that, Thank you. I'm going to let others take up the mantle from here. But as I said, there'll be a lot of redundancy. It was meant to be redundant today to really get across the issue of how these three major critical topics all come together. With that, thank you very much.